He didn't recognize himself. The changes were subtle, but they were there. He was shinier, like all the toxins had oozed out of his pores. He grabbed a washcloth and wiped the slime off of his face. He got nose to nose with himself and his reflection. He couldn't even see his pores. He tugged on his facial skin and it barely gave. He knew where all those dots had been before, and they were not there anymore. His eyes were different too. They were paler. They had been hazel before, but they were turning a light green. His skin color was off also. He thought that he should look pale the way he felt, but he looked like he had been to a tanning salon at least twice in the last month. His lips were paler, though. They almost matched his skin tone. He tugged at his mouth. His teeth still looked the same. He looked down at his hands. His cuticles had grown about 1/3 of the way up his fingernails. He grabbed the nail file off the toilet tank and tried to push them back. They did not budge. The metal nail file even bent from his effort. He gave up and threw the file onto the floor. It clanked on the tile. He was panting. He had been thrilled when he had woken up in the forest and found his wounds had healed. He tried to get himself back to that state of mind with deep, steady breaths. Why hadn't Sue told him just how bad he looked? The changes were enough for him to at least look off. Someone else would just notice that there was something different but not be able to pinpoint it exactly. To him they were big alterations, and he knew they would intensify. He tried to calm himself down further. He was successful after a few more breaths. He had known changes were coming. These were less drastic than his wounds healing over instantly and him shitting and puking himself empty. Why was he getting so upset about disappearing pores, a tan, pale eyes, and covered fingernails? He knew it was because he had needed the change at first. It had been successful, but he didn't need it or want it to go on any further. But it was too late. Maybe he would flip through the book to try to find a way to undo the process. He knew that he wouldn't find one, though. He had already been through the book enough to know that. If there was a way to undo it, he didn't currently have access to that information. Maybe the internet would help. He noticed one more thing while examining his face in the mirror. When he turned his head, he noticed that his ears were a little smaller. It was such a tiny mutation that he hadn't even noticed. He'd had to look hard at himself to spot the slight transformations, and he was more concerned and familiar with the way he looked than anybody else, even Sue. He could see how what was specifically off about him got past her. She had noticed that there was something odd, however. He turned the cold knob and let the cooler water mix in with the hot. He got naked and got in the shower stream. He soaped up his body. It was just a little different all over. It was still lean but more muscular. His veins were hidden under the skin. The scar on his left knee was smaller. Suddenly the drain strainer clogged with hair. It had all come off his arms and legs. The majority of what had been on his chest rinsed away as well. He grabbed the wet hair up in his fingers and threw it into the wastebasket under the sink. It didn't look too bad. His arms and legs looked more muscular, and his pectorals did too. He would just shave the rest off. He actually thought it looked better. When he went to shampoo his head, more clumps of hair came out into his hands. He was grabbing large fistfuls and throwing it into the trash as well. That was when his vanity kicked in. He'd had a great head of hair. Maybe it would have been all right if it had all fallen out, but there was so much left, just not enough to look good. He would use Sue's grooming scissors and disposable razor and shave his head. He'd shaved his head before, and it had looked good. His head had a nice shape to it. He would be okay. He could still go out in public. He might still even be attractive. When he continued washing, he noticed that his testicles were much higher up than they had ever been before. He'd had low hangers, and they were pulled up tight against the base of the shaft of his penis and separated there. The ballsack skin was tight, too. He found a way not to mind that either. His balls had always hung below the tip of his cock, and them rising up made him look even better endowed than he already was. The fact that there was less pubic hair helped the visual as well. He hoped the length of his dick wouldn't shorten. If it did, though, he would deal. It hadn't gotten much use anyway, other than to piss and masturbate. It would be okay. He would be okay. He got out of his less than relaxing shower and towel dried. He then cut all the remaining hair on his head as short as he could with the scissors. Then he rubbed Sue's shaving cream, which she used for her own hair removal, on his scalp. He slowly made paths of skin in his sparse hair. He was careful not to cut his scalp. Scabs on a bald head were always so ugly. He then rubbed the razor sideways on his head to try and cut it deliberately. He couldn't. It didn't even sting. He barely felt the pressure of the blade. There were advantages, along with all the disadvantages. The disadvantages were all of a vain nature anyway. and that wasn't really important to him. Maybe he would never have to shave his face again. He always hated doing that. He made himself look good enough to feel comfortable in public. With the shaved head being the most noticeable change, he still thought he could pass as attractive. His fingernails were the only truly freaky-looking things, but someone could just assume that it was bad grooming, and if it got worse, he could wear gloves. Everything would be all right. He left the bathroom and headed for the bedroom that had become his. "Whoa!" Sue said when she saw him. She was on the sofa watching TV. Rosemary was curled up asleep in her lap. "What?" Rob asked nervously. "Does it look all right?" "Yes, actually. It's a drastic change, but you're pulling it off. It suits you. Why'd you go all Sigourney Weaver?" He knew she was referring to the third installment of the Alien movies. "Just wanted a change. You really think it looks okay?" Then he tried a lie. "I can wear a hat till it grows back if not." "No, it looks good, I tell you." He knew she was being honest, and he felt a huge relief. Rosemary slept through the conversation. Sue asked him, "How are you feeling?" He'd been so focused on how he looked that he forgot that he still felt like crap. "So-so," he said as he tilted his hand back and forth to gesture the feeling as well. "I'm sorry." "It's fine. I'm sure I'll feel better after I sleep." "You want something to eat first?" He contemplated that, but then realized that a lot of the pain was in his stomach. "No, I'll try to eat something later." "All right. Help yourself." "I might be back up before you go to bed," he said, realizing how early in the night it still was. "Just a cat nap might help. It looks like it's doing Rosemary some good." Rosemary's paws were twitching in her sleep. "The name seems to be sticking," Sue admitted. "Good night for now." "Night," he said back as he went to his room and closed the door. He turned on the bedside lamp. It seemed so bright. He picked it up and put it on the floor where it wouldn't shine in his eyes. He curled up on the bed and tried to knock out. His smooth skin felt good against the cool, crisp linen, especially on his scalp. There was no hair lightly tugging on his arms and legs as he moved around trying to get more comfortable. It was a neat sensation. His outer body felt fine, but it was his insides that felt tore up. His gut was cramping, but he did not feel like he had to take a shit. It was churning. His mouth felt hot and was watering. He had to gulp more and more frequently. He was beginning to ache. His entire body was starting to clench, and he began to wonder if the force causing it would levitate him off the bed like Linda Blair. Something was happening to him. Then the knowledge of what was happening hit him along with the fear of it. He was starting to hunger. It had been a week. Chapter 6. Dan sat in the beat-up old Ford Fairlane 500 that he'd had since he had gotten it from the elderly pastry shop owner who had given it to him instead of 2 weeks of pay. He felt like he had been taken advantage of. The guy couldn't have gotten any more for it. It ran, but barely. He had lived in it for a brief while before moving into the small blue house that he was staring at. That bitch was in there. He could see her shadow moving across the curtain in the living room. She probably already had some dickhead in there with her. The little brat's room on the side of the house was dark. He began to clench his hands on the steering wheel. He rubbed his palms back and forth against it, gathering the will to do what he had set out to do. It was time. He opened the heavy car door and absently slammed it shut behind him. A dog started barking somewhere off in the neighborhood. He hated that dog. He had woken up too many times to the sound of that damn mutt woofing away. It would not give away his arrival. It was an alarm that was always sounding. He approached the side of the house. He wasn't exactly sure of what was going to happen. He knew the gist, though, and that was all that was really important. He staggered across the street and onto the lawn. It had not been cut in a while. It was almost knee-high. He was surprised that she hadn't gotten some sucker to cut it for a blowjob. She was a real skanky bitch. None of them ever measured up to his dear old ma. He made his path through the tall grass and weeds and went to peek in on his son. He couldn't believe he didn't hear the little fucker crying. He always cried. Cried and shit, that was it. Some babies usually slept enough to give you somewhat of a break. Not that one, though. That one had never seemed to sleep. It was dark in his son's room. The curtains were parted a ways, but his vision hadn't adjusted enough for him to make out the insides of the room quite yet. He was going to will the demons to come forth and take that little brat right back on through the wall with them. They always came out of the walls. He was standing there and looking down at the blue aluminum siding on the house. They would not come out on that side, would they? They never had before. They had always come from the inside of the walls. That was just how they worked. They kept themselves out of the view of the common public. The public didn't deserve to get to see them. They were unworthy. He had been allowed to see them many times. He was special, though. They knew that. That was why they had come and listened to what he had to say to them. The demon's hand had never quite reached the light switch to turn it off. It had just taken a shot in the light instead of the dark. It had given up pretty quickly. That was because it knew he was smart and shielded himself with the light in the living room. It was also the first time he had tried to really speak to one of them. He had screamed at them to go away in the past, but it was all very different since he figured out why they were coming. They were logical beings, and he had spoken rationally to them. Surely they had understood and made a deal. He would be spared in order to further help their cause. They had let him speak, and hadn't given up and gone back through the hole into their world until after he was done speaking his mind. He had stated it all very simply and briefly. They had to understand. They had to agree. They had to be reasonable. He heard the familiar sound of their exit and knew he had begun his sacred assignment.